Richard Langston was the kind of man people waved to without thinking twice. Quiet, kind, and visible in the way only someone with something to hide can be. For 40 years, he fooled his wife, his neighbors, and even the FBI, but Richard wasn't who he said he was. In his small town of Stafford, Virginia, he was known as the quiet man who never caused trouble and always had time to help others. He told stories of his days in the Air Force, how he served overseas, and how he returned to the States in the early 80s to start fresh. Richard had no children of his own, but he treated Margaret's nieces and nephews as if they were his blood. He didn't even have a smartphone. He paid in cash, avoided credit cards, and never owed a cent to anyone. To the local community, he was simply the man who had done his duty, settled down, and lived quietly. Margaret used to joke that her husband was stuck in the past, but she found it endearing. Richard smiled calmly and said he'd lost it in a house fire years ago in North Carolina. Something didn't sit right with him. He had worked in law enforcement for 30 years and had a gut feeling that something about Richard wasn't what it seemed. Tom decided to do some digging on his own, just out of curiosity. That seemed believable. Fires happened, and so did lost paperwork. Weeks later, the result came in: no military service record found. No Social Security file until 1982, no tax records before that date either. It was as if Richard Langston didn't exist before 1982. Tom found that highly unusual. Most people, even those with gaps in their history, had some traceable data. The FBI began to suspect that Richard Langston might not be his real name at all. As far as they were concerned, Richard was the gentle old man who donated to the food bank and helped shovel snow from the church parking lot. No one imagined he might be hiding a darker past, not even his wife. Whoever he was, he had built a new life from scratch and kept the truth buried for decades. School records, driver's licenses, past addresses. But Richard had nothing. The committee quietly decided to move forward anyway, relying on his stories and the trust they had in him. He made it clear that he wasn't accusing anyone, only asking for a second opinion. A third in the background of a news photo taken near the scene of a bombing in Denver, 1978. His face was slightly aged in each, his hair styled differently, but it was unmistakably him. Within days, the contact at the FBI confirmed that something was off. The agency ran Richard's face through older databases using facial recognition software. He told people he had grown tired of big cities and wanted to settle down somewhere peaceful. It matched with when he first appeared in the system. Before that, there was nothing. And to their surprise, his face popped up several times in surveillance photos from the late 1970s and early 1980s. Each time, he was listed under a different name. He said the digital world was too fast, too invasive. He liked his peace, his privacy. He was gentle, soft-spoken, and always gave the impression that he had lived a full, if slightly mysterious, life. Agents were assigned to quietly look into Richard Langston's life. They found it strange how meticulously he had kept his existence offline. No digital records, no credit history. He had no registered car under his name, no passport application, no voting history until 1984. When asked about his family, he claimed most of them had passed away or drifted apart. Richard's name was submitted by the church pastor. The plan was simple: verify each person's service record, confirm identity, and order the custom plaques. A few members made casual jokes about government mistakes, and no one was too concerned. But when further checks were made, the situation became more confusing. There were no enlistment papers, no discharge records, no record of basic training, nothing. But when the committee reached out to military archives, something strange happened. They couldn't find any official record of Richard Langston having ever served in the Air Force or in any branch of the military at all. No one questioned it. After all, many veterans carried painful pasts they didn't like to revisit. He volunteered twice a week at the local church and made quiet donations to food drives. Every year he attended the Memorial Day ceremony and placed his hand solemnly over his heart. People looked up to him. They trusted him, some even admired him. He lived in a simple two-story home on a tree-lined street with his wife of 38 years, Margaret. Their house was modest, clean, and filled with trinkets from flea markets and second-hand stores. The neighbors often said how lucky Margaret was to have such a devoted husband. He mowed the lawn every Saturday morning, waved at children walking to school, and brought in the trash cans for the elderly widow next door. His real name was Paul Whitmore, and behind his gentle smile was a past soaked in blood, money, and betrayal. Richard Langston appeared to be the kind of man people trusted without hesitation. To the casual observer, there was nothing unusual about Richard. His marriage with Margaret seemed strong. They were the couple who still held hands during Sunday services and exchanged Christmas cards with handwritten notes. Richard didn't use social media. He preferred old-fashioned things, paperbacks over e-readers, vinyl records over streaming apps, handwritten letters over emails. Years passed without anything out of place. Richard worked part-time at a used bookstore, shelving novels and recommending military biographies to older customers. Then came the year the Veterans Recognition Committee decided to honor local servicemen with plaques at the town center. The committee initially assumed it was a paperwork issue. After all, records from the 70s and 80s sometimes got lost or misfiled. Still wanting to present the award, one of the organizers approached Richard at church to ask if he could provide a copy of his DD-214, the standard discharge document. But one member of the committee, retired police officer Tom Harris, couldn't let it go. He submitted a background request using an old contact at the Department of Veterans Affairs. Tom quietly passed this information along to a federal contact he had worked with years ago. The photos weren't criminal mugshots, but they were enough to raise concern. One showed him at a protest in Chicago, another in San Francisco. What started as a small-town award nomination was now a potential federal investigation. They started building a timeline. According to Richard's own stories, he had moved to Virginia in 1984 after working odd jobs in the South. This total absence of identity before 1982 wasn't just unusual, it was nearly impossible. It would take intentional effort to erase a life that completely. Still, no one in town had the slightest clue. And so, while the town prepared to engrave his name on a plaque meant to honor heroes, the FBI began to unearth the life of a man who had fooled them all for 40 years. The quiet life Richard Langston had lived for decades was now under a silent but growing federal spotlight. What had begun as a harmless check for a veteran's plaque had quickly escalated into a full-scale background investigation. The FBI, suspicious about the lack of history prior to 1982, decided to dig deeper. Their findings only made the mystery more disturbing. There were no hospital records of his birth, no school enrollment, no college transcripts, no marriage licenses from any previous relationship. The FBI suspected he had once been involved with a domestic extremist group active in the 1970s. The group, long since disbanded, had been responsible for a series of robberies and bombings across the country. They needed hard evidence to arrest a man who, as far as the world could tell, was a law-abiding citizen. They began surveillance on his home, quietly tapping into financial records, monitoring phone activity, and collecting DNA samples from discarded items like coffee cups and tissues taken from public trash bins. Local police closed the case quickly, and Whitmore was declared legally dead. She had met him years after his supposed death, during a time when records were easier to forge and digital tracking was nearly non-existent. Agents interviewed her friends, neighbors, and co-workers. All described her as kind and trusting. No one ever suspected she was living beside a man hiding from murder charges. It read, "I always knew this day would come." Only this time they knew exactly who he was. But once again he was gone. It wasn't signed. The FBI searched the area extensively but found no trace of him. Drones, dogs, and divers were brought in. The forest around the lake was dense, with many trails and access points to nearby highways. It was a perfect place to disappear again. Margaret had once told a friend that Richard didn't like talking about his past because he had seen too many bad things in the war. The lie had served him well. Months later, Richard Langston appeared for the first time. New name, new social security number, new life. He moved through the South, taking odd jobs, always staying under the radar. By 1985, he met Margaret at a church picnic and slowly built his new identity around her. Everything was done without Richard or Margaret knowing. The agents wanted to be certain before they made a move. One particular event stood out: the 1975 armored truck heist in New Mexico that left 2 security guards dead and $6 million missing. They were planning to arrest him quietly, without media attention, and begin charging him with armed robbery, murder, identity fraud, and obstruction of justice. They wanted to ensure he had no way of escaping again. But before they could act, something unexpected happened. Richard took a sudden trip with Margaret to a lake cabin they often visited during the summer. He left no digital trail, but a traffic camera captured his car heading north out of Virginia. Richard had almost no electronic footprint. He paid bills by mail, used only a debit card tied to a local bank, and never filed taxes jointly with Margaret. When they arrived at the cabin 3 days later, they found it abandoned. No sign of forced entry, no signs of struggle. But Richard was gone. Margaret remained, confused and shaken. She said Richard had told her he was going fishing early that morning and never returned. His car was still parked behind the cabin. His phone was left on the kitchen counter. The only thing missing was his wallet. He never applied for a passport, avoided doctor visits, and hadn't renewed his driver's license in over a decade. He did everything to stay out of official databases, but the most alarming detail was what he did for income. Richard had no visible employment on record after 1990. He told friends he had saved well and didn't need much. But the FBI discovered regular cash deposits of small amounts, never more than $500 at a time, going back over 30 years. The getaway driver had vanished without a trace. One member was arrested and later died in prison. The others either fled overseas or disappeared entirely. The case had remained cold for decades. His identity seemed to spring into existence one day in the early 1980s with no trace of a past behind it. That, in itself, was highly unusual. But what followed was even more alarming. Using advanced software, analysts cross-referenced photographs, old surveillance footage, and media archives from the 1970s. Facial recognition technology flagged Richard Langston's face multiple times, but never under the same name. One photo placed him at a university campus in Berkeley, someone who hadn't merely started a new life, but had erased an entire past with deliberate care. Most fugitives slip up eventually, use old contacts, or fall back into recognizable patterns. But Richard hadn't. For over 40 years he had lived without drawing attention, without being arrested, and without ever trying to cash in on his past. That level of control and discipline was rare and dangerous. Another at a political rally in Washington, D.C. A grainy image from 1975 even showed him standing on a sidewalk near a federal courthouse just hours before it was bombed. He wasn't the main suspect in any of these events, but his repeated presence at scenes tied to radical activism and political unrest raised serious questions. The FBI began to suspect they were dealing with more than just a man who changed his name. This was a master of reinvention. A task force quietly formed to piece together who Richard Langston really was. The FBI decided to re-examine the old case files. Among the evidence was a low-resolution surveillance photo of the driver taken from across the street minutes before the robbery. They ran the image through their system again using updated software. The results stunned the agents. The face matched Richard Langston with a 97% probability. If this identification was correct, then Richard was not just a man with a secret, he was one of the most wanted fugitives of the 20th century who had successfully hidden in plain sight for more than 40 years. Despite the shocking discovery, the FBI chose not to act immediately. They needed more than just a facial match. What they found only deepened the mystery. DNA analysis confirmed the FBI's suspicions. The genetic sample from Richard's trash matched a sample taken from a cigarette, but left inside the getaway car from the 1975 armored truck robbery. The odds of coincidence were astronomically low. The man known as Richard Langston was positively identified as Paul Whitmore, a name long forgotten by most, but still active on the FBI's most wanted list buried deep under cold cases. Investigators began building a timeline. Paul Whitmore had faked his death in 1981 after staging a boat explosion off the coast of Florida. Debris was found, no body was recovered. The FBI found no evidence that Margaret had ever known the truth. By now, the FBI was close to making their move. Agents followed. A note was later discovered tucked into one of his books, marked by a folded dollar bill. Despite their efforts, the man who had fooled an entire town lived a double life, and outsmarted federal authorities once more had vanished into thin air. The search for Richard Langston, now confirmed as Paul Whitmore, quickly became one of the most discreet yet intense manhunts in recent FBI history. Officials chose not to release his real identity to the public just yet. Their focus shifted to the basement, an area Richard had always kept locked, even from Margaret. She had assumed it was where he stored old tools and boxes of paperwork. When investigators broke in, what they found told a different story. There were also pages detailing counter-surveillance techniques, notes about how to assume a new identity, and even sketches of floor plans for different safe houses across the country. Many of these locations had been used decades ago by radical groups to hide out after attacks or robberies. They looked at property records, cross-country travel logs, and any mention of those identities in public or private records. The FBI kept her under surveillance, not because they suspected her, but to make sure Paul wouldn't try to contact her. He would avoid cameras in stores and covered his computer webcam with tape, even though he barely used the internet. Drones flew over the region for days, but nothing turned up. The note found at the cabin, simple and chilling, suggested he had always known his true identity could surface. No wanted posters went up. To the rest of the town, Richard Langston was simply a man who had gone missing during a peaceful weekend at the lake. Whispers spread, of course. Some said he had a stroke and wandered off. Others believed he was attacked by a drifter. Margaret never corrected them. She simply stayed indoors, silent and broken. And he had prepared accordingly. The FBI theorized he may have returned to an old safe house or crossed the border with another identity. If he had forged documents ready and knew where to disappear, catching him again would be nearly impossible. One lead came from a man who reported seeing someone matching Richard's description hitchhiking near a truck stop 2 days after he had vanished. But by the time agents arrived, the man was gone. Another tip claimed a gray-haired man had paid cash for a canoe at a bait shop 3 towns over. The owner remembered the man because he asked a lot of questions about river directions. Again, the trail ended there. She assumed it was a veteran's instinct, something born from trauma. But now it was clear he had been hiding more than just memories. She had already handed over everything she knew, but her confusion remained clear. She cried often, not just because he was gone, but because the person she had loved for nearly 4 decades had never truly existed. He had done it once before, disappeared without leaving a clue. And now, after 4 decades of living a lie, he had done it again, this time with even more precision. The question that haunted investigators was simple but maddening. How do you catch a man who has spent his entire life perfecting the art of vanishing? She described Richard as kind, predictable, and a little boring. He liked black coffee, read war novels, and hated technology. She had never seen any violent side, never caught him in a major lie. She believed him to be a man of simple habits. But now, knowing he had once carried a gun into a deadly heist, she began to question every moment of their life together. One alias, Daniel Price, had rented a storage unit in rural West Virginia 10 years earlier. Another, Frank Hauser, had purchased a car in Alabama under a fake license. Each alias was tied to small transactions and brief appearances before disappearing again. He had clearly been testing identities, preparing multiple escape routes in case his current life ever came crashing down. The room was more than a storage space. It was a shrine to a life of calculated deception and survival. Behind a wooden shelving unit and a false wall was a hidden room, small, silent, and cold. The bills were dated from the 1970s, many marked with serial numbers tied to the armored truck robbery in New Mexico. It wasn't the full $6 million that had gone missing, but the FBI estimated there was at least $700,000 in the box. That money, untouched and well-preserved, directly linked Richard to the robbery and the double murder that had haunted investigators for nearly 5 decades. Inside were several old trunks, meticulously labeled and locked. They wanted to avoid tipping him off or sparking a media frenzy that could drive him further underground. Surveillance teams worked around the clock, reviewing highway footage, gas station records, and any possible signs of movement. But there were no credit card swipes, no phone signals, no security footage showing his face after that cabin trip. It was as if he had simply dissolved into the forest. Agents returned to the couple's house in Stafford, this time with a full search warrant. Once opened, the trunks revealed the layers of Richard's hidden life. The first contained forged documents, driver's licenses from different states, social security cards under different names, birth certificates, and even a few expired passports. They showed a younger Richard, or rather Paul, attending protests, sitting in cafes with people who were later linked to radical groups, and posing in front of cars with license plates from different states. One photo stood out. It showed him standing beside two men, one of whom had been killed in a 1978 standoff with federal agents. That connection confirmed Paul Whitmore had once been deeply embedded in the underground networks of domestic extremism. Each alias was complete with backstories, addresses, and supporting paperwork. None of them matched each other, but all of them had been created with extreme care. The FBI quickly realized he had maintained several identities over the decades, each one ready to be used if the need to escape ever arose. In another trunk, they found hundreds of photographs, most of them black and white or faded Polaroids. Other boxes contained strange keepsakes, old typewriters, film negatives, and notebooks filled with coded writing. One final discovery made the agents freeze. Hidden in a fireproof lockbox was a stack of cash, wrapped in plastic and aged with time. Back at headquarters, analysts began retracing every known alias Paul had used. Meanwhile, Margaret Langston sat alone in the house she had shared with a man she thought she knew. Margaret told agents that Richard had always been cautious, even paranoid at times. He refused to fly. He never traveled outside of the country. The FBI canvassed surrounding areas for leads. Dogs searched the woods behind the lake cabin. It became increasingly clear that Paul Whitmore had activated a long-planned escape. The public remained unaware. The FBI chose to keep the case classified under national security grounds, citing the sensitivity of Paul's past affiliations. No press releases were made. Despite the growing number of agents on the case, Paul Whitmore's trail went cold again. The FBI expanded the search, bringing in agents from multiple field offices and consulting with retired investigators who had worked the original armored truck robbery case. Every scrap of evidence, every name mentioned in Paul Whitmore's radical circles from the 1970s was re-examined. Former associates were tracked down and questioned. Many had moved on with their lives, some had gone completely legitimate, while others had done prison time and disappeared into obscurity. The one thing they all had in common was silence. Most claimed they hadn't seen or heard from Paul since the early 1980s. A reporter from a local paper published a story about a missing man named Richard Langston, whose background couldn't be verified. Months passed, then, without warning, a new lead surfaced. A Canadian Border Patrol agent reported that a man matching Paul's description had crossed into Quebec under the name Harold Benson, using a U.S. passport. When officials examined surveillance footage, they saw a man with white hair, glasses, and a limp that hadn't been there before. They renewed the warrant for his arrest and submitted updated information to Interpol. Others thought he had escaped by sea, possibly on a smuggled vessel heading toward South America. A master of vanishing who fooled the government, outlasted the law, and lived two completely different lives with precision. Those who studied criminal psychology called it one of the most successful identity frauds in American history, but it was more than that. It was a complete transformation, executed over decades, right under the noses of everyone around him. A few believed he had once again faked his death, this time so perfectly that not even the FBI would realize it. People posted grainy photos of elderly men with similar faces in diners and parks, convinced they had spotted him. But each tip led to nothing. His profile was circulated quietly among international law enforcement circles, along with new facial composites showing how he might look with altered features. But without fingerprints, a confirmed location, or a digital trail, there was little anyone could do. Paul Whitmore had vanished before. He had simply done it again with the same skill, patience, and precision as before. He wore a wide-brimmed hat and kept his face low. The passport, later proven to be a high-quality forgery, had been flagged only after the story of Richard Langston began circulating online. That story was picked up by regional outlets, then by national true crime blogs. Speculation grew quickly. His file remained open, updated with each new development, no matter how small. But the most chilling thought of all was the simplest one. Maybe he was still out there walking through a market with a new name, buying groceries with untraceable cash, sitting silently among people who had no idea who he really was. Maybe the man who had fooled everyone for 40 years had simply begun again. Over the years, the tips slowed down, but the questions remained. Had he changed his face again? Had he slipped into a third identity somewhere even quieter? Or had he died alone in the wilderness, buried by time and secrecy? Some believed he was a retired spy. Others thought he had been in witness protection. Online forums dissected blurry photos and crafted theories that ranged from the plausible to the outrageous. A few seemed genuinely shocked to learn he was still alive. Others offered vague responses, as if choosing carefully what not to say. They checked inns, lakeside lodges, and ferry docks. They interviewed employees, travelers, and boat owners. The house had become a constant reminder that her marriage had been a carefully performed lie. Her friends tried to support her, but she stopped attending church, stopped answering her phone, and eventually left town altogether. She sold the property quietly and disappeared from the public eye. No one blamed her. If anything, people pitied her. She had lost a husband and discovered she had never really had one to begin with. Still, the trail vanished again. It was becoming obvious that Paul had another identity already prepared for life in Canada, perhaps even more than one. He might have known the border crossing would eventually be flagged and planned a secondary exit into deeper wilderness. The FBI created a psychological profile to understand how a man could live undetected for so long. They believed Paul had not just changed his name, he had transformed his identity on a psychological level. A unit in southern Georgia contained dusty boxes of outdated military manuals, radio parts, and notebooks written in shorthand. Another in western Pennsylvania held expired IDs and receipts from survival supply stores. These caches were old, abandoned, and hadn't been accessed in years, but they confirmed that Paul had built backup options long before he ever needed them. It was clear now this man didn't just plan one escape, he planned for every possible future. Over time, he didn't act like Paul Whitmore pretending to be Richard Langston. What they found was consistent with someone living a normal, quiet life. Margaret's accounts showed small pensions, grocery store purchases, and medical bills. There were no sudden influxes of cash, no hidden accounts, no travel records outside of the couple's routine vacations. The FBI eventually concluded that she had no role in any of Paul's past crimes and had most likely been his greatest shield. Living as a beloved husband, he had created a camouflage so complete that even his closest companion never suspected a thing. He truly became Richard Langston. The routine, the mannerisms, the hobbies, even the relationships. He had erased himself from his own mind to avoid mistakes. That kind of discipline pointed to a deeper intelligence and control than they had initially expected. Most fugitives become reckless or arrogant after a few years. Paul had become invisible. Old storage units across several states were quietly opened by court order. Meanwhile, investigators began analyzing Margaret's financial history. Though she was not considered a suspect, they hoped she might have unwittingly handled clues. Eventually, media outlets began sniffing around. Though the FBI never officially named Paul Whitmore or acknowledged the manhunt, leaks began to spread. Despite the rising attention, there were no confirmed sightings. Canadian authorities joined the investigation, launching a discreet search across small towns and remote cabins in Quebec and Ontario. Back in Virginia, Margaret moved out of the home she had shared with Paul. The memories were too heavy. The FBI reclassified Paul Whitmore's case from cold to active fugitive status. Meanwhile, theories spread online like wildfire. Some believed he was still alive, living off the remaining money in a fishing village on the edge of Canada. In the absence of closure, Paul Whitmore became a kind of myth, a modern ghost. The FBI left a small team permanently assigned to his case. Nobody knew. In the years that followed Paul Whitmore's disappearance, the world slowly moved on, but the case never truly faded. Within law enforcement circles, his story became a whispered example of just how far someone could go to vanish in the modern age. The tools had changed: cameras on every corner, databases that tracked everything from license plates to online purchases, but even so, Paul had slipped through it all. For younger agents, he became a myth they studied. For veterans, he was a scar they remembered. The FBI continued to monitor old safe houses, financial networks, and forged identity trails, hoping for a misstep. A small safety deposit box was discovered in a closed-down bank in upstate New York. In it, the author spoke of living many lives and being haunted by faces no one remembers but me. He described watching the world change, moving from payphones to smartphones, from cash to digital footprints, from printed newspapers to news feeds. He admitted to moments of loneliness, but also moments of peace. There were no apologies, no regrets, just a sense of calculated detachment. Not because he was dead, but because he had mastered the art of erasing his presence from the world while still walking through it. The neighborhood had changed, new families had moved in, and the few who remembered Richard spoke of him only in quiet tones. His name remained in their databases, his photo updated with age progression software every few years. Agents continued to watch border reports, financial activity, and suspicious identity changes. Somewhere, they believed, a man named something else was living another ordinary life, smiling at strangers and blending into a town that would never know his past. Margaret had never returned. Her last known address was a small apartment in Oregon, where she lived under her maiden name, avoiding reporters and interviews. He didn't rob banks for thrill or wealth alone. He robbed the world of knowing who he really was. He was a criminal, yes, but also a master of vanishing. A man who fooled everyone for 40 years, even the FBI, and as long as there's no body, no confession, and no final mistake, his story remains unfinished, hanging in the shadows, always one step ahead. He dismantled his past, built a lie so solid it felt like truth, and lived within it so long that even he may have believed it. He became a man no one could catch, not because he ran fast, but because he walked so slowly no one ever noticed him passing by. She declined every request for comment, refusing to turn her life into another chapter of his story. He didn't rely on technology, didn't form attachments that could be used against him, and didn't leave traces that could be followed. His greatest weapon wasn't violence or manipulation, it was silence. The letter ended with a single sentence. If you are reading this, it means the world has caught up, but I was always one step ahead. The building was being sold, and the unclaimed boxes were being cataloged for auction. One box, rented under the name Gerald Noxa, known alias, linked to Paul, contained only a single item, a handwritten letter. It wasn't addressed to anyone, it had no date. It was folded neatly, written in the same careful cursive the FBI had seen before. He had been the helpful neighbor, the quiet bookstore clerk, the gentle churchgoer. No one had ever suspected the man who volunteered at the local soup kitchen had once carried a gun into a deadly heist. That he had spent his evenings reading history books, not because he enjoyed them, but because he had lived through times he could never talk about. But Paul had always been methodical. He understood the patterns that investigators followed because he had lived his life avoiding them. Of the original $6 million stolen from the armored truck robbery in 1975, a large portion had never been recovered. The discovery reignited interest in the case, though it brought no new leads. Documentaries were made. Podcasts dissected every detail. Online sleuths mapped his movements and speculated about hidden hideouts. Some believed Paul had died in the wilderness shortly after escaping. Others claimed to have seen him in Alaska, in Mexico, or even in Eastern Europe. None of the sightings were confirmed. It was both a taunt and a farewell, a reminder that he was still out there or had been until recently. The timing of when the letter had been placed in the deposit box remained a mystery. There were no security cameras in the abandoned bank, and the records had been damaged during a water leak years earlier. While the FBI found nearly $700,000 in the hidden basement box, the rest remained missing. Some agents believed Paul had stashed it somewhere, possibly in multiple locations over the years. Others suspected he had exchanged it bit by bit, laundering it carefully through cash-only businesses and low-risk transactions. But the truth was, no one knew. His identities were never flashy, never digital, never overlapping. If he had created a new life in Canada or beyond, he would have done so without touching anything that could be traced. No phones, no cards, no government services. Just a quiet existence off the grid just like before. At the heart of the case remained the unanswered question of the money. That missing money was more than just evidence. It represented the last thread that might connect Paul Whitmore to the present. Agents hoped that greed, desperation, or a mistake would one day bring him back into the light. But if the years taught them anything, it was that Paul didn't act out of desperation. He acted with patience. He had waited decades to become Richard Langston. He could easily wait decades more to become someone else. One surprising development came 5 years after his last confirmed sighting. The letter read like a reflection, perhaps even a confession. Handwriting experts confirmed it matched Paul Whitmore's previous writings. The public, once fascinated by the story, had begun turning it into legend. What made the story so haunting was not just Paul's ability to vanish, but the idea that he had lived among ordinary people for so long. One former agent described Paul as the closest thing he had ever seen to a living ghost. Back in Stafford, Virginia, the home once shared by Richard and Margaret was bought by a young couple who had no idea of its past. But for law enforcement, the case was never closed. In the end, Paul Whitmore's story wasn't just about crime. It was about transformation. Whether dead or alive, Paul Whitmore left behind a legacy that blurred the line between truth and performance.